The neighborhood of Maplewood Estates was the kind of place that looked perfect on paper. Freshly paved roads, manicured lawns, and neat rows of identical mailboxes that stood like soldiers in formation. It was the kind of place that prided itself on order, appearance, and rules. Too many rules. At the end of Oak Ridge Lane stood a property that looked a little different. The lawn wasn't manicured with ruler straight lines, and the flowers grew wild in a way that felt natural, not forced. But the centerpiece, the thing everyone noticed, was the massive oak tree that stood tall in the middle of the front yard. Its branches stretched out wide like arms embracing the sky, and its trunk was so large that two grown men couldn't wrap their arms around it. That oak tree had been there long before Maplewood Estates even existed. It was over 100 years old, a silent witness to decades of change. It had survived storms, droughts, and even a lightning strike that had left a jagged scar down one side. To the homeowner, it wasn't just a tree. It was a living piece of history. The trouble began with a letter. It came in a plain white envelope with the HOA's logo printed. Neatly in the corner, 3 tiny houses under a swooping arch, symbolizing community. Inside was a notice that read in cold, bureaucratic language, "Your property is in violation of HOA Code 4.2b, obstruction of uniform aesthetic. The large oak tree must be removed within 30 days, or face fines up to $500 per day." At first it seemed like a misunderstanding. After all, the oak had always been there. It wasn't obstructing anything, and no one had ever complained before. But the letter was clear, and the signature at the bottom, Martha Reynolds, HOA President, left no doubt about who was behind it. Martha Reynolds had lived in Maplewood Estates for 10 years and had been HOA President for 8. She was known for her obsession with neighborhood standards and her unrelenting enforcement of even the most trivial rules. Her flower beds had to match the season. Her shutters were always freshly painted, and her lawn looked like something out of a golf course brochure. To her, the oak tree was a problem. It didn't fit her vision of Maplewood perfection. Within days of the notice, a few other neighbors started whispering. Some said the tree was too big. Others claimed it blocked sunlight. But most people didn't care. They were just afraid to speak up against the HOA. That was how things worked in Maplewood. You kept your head down, paid your dues, and hoped you didn't get noticed. The homeowner, however, wasn't the type to give in so easily. The oak tree had been part of the property for generations. It had shaded family picnics, hosted tire swings, and even served as a backdrop for weddings and family photos. To cut it down would be like tearing out a piece of the past. But as the days passed, the pressure grew. The HOA sent reminders. Then came threats of escalating fines. The tone of the letters turned colder, more aggressive. Words like non-compliance and legal action began to appear. The homeowner decided to investigate, not just to fight for the tree, but to understand why this was happening. After all, there were plenty of other properties with large trees. What made this one different? A trip to the county office revealed something surprising. The oak tree was listed in the Regional Environmental Database as a protected heritage tree. It was marked as one of the few remaining specimens of its age in the entire county, and removing it without a permit was not just difficult but illegal. The penalties could include massive fines and even criminal charges. That's when the first thought of revenge began to take root. If the HOA wanted the tree gone, they'd have to go through the law. And the law was firmly on the homeowner's side. The situation had flipped. What started as a threat had just turned into an opportunity. Still, the homeowner decided to play it carefully. They didn't respond to the next letter or the one after that. Instead, they quietly gathered every document: the heritage listing, the environmental protection notice, the county regulations, and waited. Meanwhile, the HOA ramped up their efforts. Martha Reynolds began sending contractors to inspect the property, claiming they were assessing safety hazards. One of them even tried to measure the tree without permission. Another neighbor later mentioned seeing Martha pacing the sidewalk in front of the property, taking photos with her phone. Then, a notice appeared on the mailbox. An official violation tag, bright orange, demanding immediate removal of the oak tree to maintain neighborhood harmony. But this time, the homeowner didn't panic. Instead, they smiled, because now the HOA had made its biggest mistake yet, putting that demand in writing. The following morning, a copy of that notice was forwarded straight to the county's environmental department, along with the heritage listing and a short note explaining that the HOA was attempting to force the destruction of a protected tree. What the homeowner didn't yet know was that this small act would set off a chain reaction, one that would not only save the oak tree, but expose something much darker lurking beneath. Maplewood's perfect facade as the sun set behind the wide branches of the oak, the golden light filtering through its leaves. The homeowner sat quietly on the porch, watching the shadows stretch across the yard. The tree stood tall, unwavering, a symbol of resilience against the HOA's relentless control. The storm was coming, not from the weather, but from the HOA board itself, and when it hit, it would shake Maplewood Estates to its core. End of Chapter 1. To be continued in Chapter 2. The HOA strikes back. In the following weeks, the air in Maplewood Estates grew tense. What began as a single letter had spiraled into a silent war. A cold, neighborly conflict fought through paperwork, whispers, and warnings. The oak tree stood unbothered, its leaves rustling in the wind, as if mocking the small minds waging battle beneath its shade. But the homeowner could feel the pressure mounting. It started subtly. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. The friendly smiles vanished. The HOA had begun its quiet campaign, a tactic as old as homeowner associations themselves: social isolation. Within the walls of the HOA's community center, Martha Reynolds was fuming. The letter she'd sent had backfired spectacularly. Not only had the homeowner ignored the order, but word had reached the county. The HOA had received a formal inquiry from the environmental department asking for clarification about unauthorized interference with a protected heritage tree. Martha saw it as a personal attack. She had built her reputation on enforcing order, and this defiance felt like a stain on her legacy. She refused to back down. At the next HOA meeting, held in the beige-painted clubhouse that smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee, Martha laid out her plan. She called the oak tree a liability. She claimed its roots might be damaging underground pipes, its branches might be unsafe, and its falling leaves were creating hazards. The board, mostly composed of her close friends, nodded in agreement. Most of them owed her favors. She'd helped them waive minor violations in the past. The decision was unanimous. The tree had to go. But there was a problem. The HOA couldn't legally cut it down without permission, and now that the county was involved, they had to tread carefully. So Martha changed tactics. If she couldn't remove the tree directly, she would force the homeowner's hand through other means. Within days, the homeowner began receiving new citations. First, it was overgrown grass under the oak. Then, improper maintenance of decorative elements. Then, inconsistent mailbox paint. Each violation carried a fine, small at first, but they added up. The letters became relentless. The homeowner's mailbox, once filled with flyers and coupons, now overflowed with notices. The HOA was bleeding them dry with technicalities, but instead of panicking, the homeowner stayed calm. They kept records, every letter, every fine, every date. Each envelope was carefully opened, documented, and filed away. What Martha didn't realize was that her campaign of intimidation was building a paper trail that would soon come back to haunt her. One afternoon, as the homeowner raked leaves under the oak tree, a pickup truck pulled up. A man in a reflective vest stepped out, clipboard in hand. He introduced himself as an inspector from the County Environmental Division. He'd come to see the tree. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint claiming it was diseased and dangerous. The homeowner knew immediately who was behind it. Martha was escalating again, this time trying to get the county to declare the oak a safety risk. The inspector walked around the tree, studied the trunk, examined the branches, and took a few photos. Then, after about 15 minutes, he smiled and shook his head. The oak was perfectly healthy. What he didn't say, but what the homeowner later discovered, was that filing false environmental complaints was a serious offense. The inspector noted the HOA's involvement and flagged the report for review. That single visit planted another seed, this time in the county's legal department. Days turned into weeks, and the tension spread through Maplewood like wildfire. The HOA meetings grew more heated. Some residents began to question why so much time and money was being spent fighting one homeowner over a tree. Martha brushed off their concerns, insisting it was about principle. But cracks were forming in her leadership. Rumors began circulating that the HOA's budget was running thin. Legal consultations, paperwork fees, and code enforcement costs were piling up. Still, Martha pressed on. She issued a final ultimatum: remove the tree or face foreclosure proceedings under the HOA's bylaws for unpaid fines. That was the breaking point. The homeowner, armed with a binder full of evidence, contacted a property rights attorney who specialized in HOA abuse cases. The attorney, a calm and methodical man, reviewed the documents with growing disbelief. What the HOA had done wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. They had violated multiple homeowner protection statutes and environmental preservation laws. Together, they filed a formal complaint against the HOA, not just with the county, but with the state's Housing Regulatory Board. Within 2 weeks, Maplewood Estates received an official notice of investigation. The HOA's accounts were frozen pending review. Every fine issued in the last 6 months had to be justified. Every expense had to be documented. When the news spread, panic rippled through the neighborhood. Homeowners who had quietly suffered under Martha's rule suddenly found their voices. They began questioning her leadership, demanding answers, even calling emergency board meetings. Martha tried to hold her ground, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. But the evidence was mounting. Copies of the threatening letters, photos of inspectors sent without cause, and reports of harassment. It was undeniable. Meanwhile, the oak tree stood tall, its leaves shimmering under the sunlight, casting a calm shadow over the chaos it had unintentionally created. The homeowner couldn't help but feel a sense of poetic justice. The tree had endured storms for a century, and now it had become the instrument of the HOA's unraveling. But the battle wasn't over. As investigators began digging through the HOA's financial records, they discovered something unexpected. Discrepancies in the accounting books, missing funds, misreported maintenance fees, unauthorized administrative expenses signed off by Martha herself. The oak tree had merely been the beginning. Now the entire HOA's operation was under a microscope. The homeowner watched quietly from their porch as new inspectors arrived. Not from the county, but from the state. Clipboards in hand, they examined documents, interviewed residents, and reviewed bank statements. Martha could no longer hide behind her rules or her reputation. The once pristine image of Maplewood Estates began to crumble. What had been marketed as an exclusive, harmonious community was now a neighborhood divided, half supporting Martha, half demanding her resignation. At the center of it all, the oak tree remained, strong, ancient, and unshakable. The homeowner knew the storm was far from over. The HOA had struck back, but they had exposed something far worse than a neighborhood dispute. They had revealed the rot beneath their perfect lawns and white fences. And as the first cracks of scandal began to spread, the homeowner realized something else. The real revenge was only beginning. The storm that had begun as a neighborhood dispute had now grown into something far larger. What started as a petty demand over an old oak tree had become a full-blown investigation that threatened to uproot the entire HOA from the ground up. By the time the state investigators arrived in Maplewood Estates, the once idyllic neighborhood had lost its shine. Lawns still glimmered under the sun, but behind every trimmed hedge and flower bed, tension simmered. Neighbors whispered across driveways, sharing rumors about missing money and secret HOA meetings. For the first time in years, fear no longer ran only one way. The homeowner, who had endured months of letters, fines, and intimidation, now found themselves in an unfamiliar position. They were being left alone. Martha Reynolds had stopped sending notices. The HOA office, which once buzzed with activity, now sat strangely quiet. The bold orange violation tags that used to decorate the mailbox were gone. But silence didn't mean safety. It meant calculation. Behind closed doors, Martha was scrambling. The state investigators had demanded full access to all HOA financial records for the past 5 years. They wanted explanations for every transaction, every landscaping invoice, every maintenance bill, every legal retainer. And buried in those records were the signs of what she had worked so hard to hide. For years, Martha had treated the HOA's budget as her personal fund. She justified it under vague categories: administrative costs, board expenses, special projects. Most homeowners never bothered to look closely. They paid their dues automatically, trusting the board to manage things properly. But the investigation had pulled everything into the light. The first discovery came quickly. Thousands of dollars in tree removal fees paid to a landscaping company that didn't exist. The name on the invoices was fabricated, the address linked to a P.O. box registered under Martha's cousin. The funds had been redirected quietly over time, disguised among legitimate expenses. Then came the security maintenance bills, payments to a contracting firm for neighborhood patrols that never actually took place. The company's registration traced back to one of Martha's friends on the board. Together, they had built a small web of corruption, feeding off the HOA's funds like termites inside a hollow wall. The investigators weren't subtle about it. They knocked on doors, asked questions, and showed residents documents they'd never seen before. For many, it was the first time they realized just how deep Martha's control had run. The homeowner watched all this unfold with quiet satisfaction. They hadn't wanted a war, only to protect their oak tree. But now that the truth was surfacing, they felt an odd sense of justice. The HOA had spent months trying to strip away something ancient and rooted, something that had stood long before their rules existed. And now, it was the HOA itself being uprooted. Still, the process was slow, and Martha wasn't ready to surrender. She called an emergency HOA meeting, her voice trembling as she tried to maintain control. She claimed the investigation was a misunderstanding, a smear campaign orchestrated by disgruntled residents. But her words fell flat. Fewer people showed up than usual. Those who did sat in silence, avoiding her gaze. The power she had once held, the power of intimidation, was slipping away. Then came the blow that broke everything. One of the investigators uncovered an internal memo, an email from Martha to her vice president, dated just a month before the oak tree dispute began. In it, she had discussed plans for a community beautification project. Attached was a sketch of the neighborhood entrance, expanded, modernized, and framed by a new brick pathway. The problem? The design included an extra section of land that wasn't part of the HOA's common area. It was private property, belonging to the homeowner. The oak tree had stood directly in the way of that expansion. The pieces clicked into place like a cruel puzzle. Martha hadn't wanted the tree removed because of aesthetics or safety. She wanted it gone because she had already planned to take over that section of land, to use it for her pet project, one that would have boosted her reputation and justified another round of dues increases. Her campaign against the homeowner had been nothing more than an attempt to clear the obstacle, literally and figuratively, standing in her way. When that information spread, it shattered the last remnants of her credibility. Even her loyal supporters began turning on her. People who had once enforced her rules now demanded her resignation. Homeowners started gathering signatures for a recall vote. Martha fought back with the same arrogance that had defined her rule. She accused the homeowner of leaking private information, of defamation. But the investigation wasn't going away. The state had already frozen the HOA's accounts and issued formal charges of financial misconduct. The once pristine Maplewood Estates was now a battleground of paper, power, and pride. Meanwhile, the homeowner's life began to return to something close to normal. The daily letters stopped. The fines were declared void. Even the neighbors who had once avoided them began stopping by, offering quiet apologies and homemade pies, small tokens of regret for not speaking up sooner. But the homeowner wasn't done. They knew that people like Martha didn't just give up. They plotted. And sure enough, late one evening, a notice appeared taped to the homeowner's door. Unsigned, typed in the same cold HOA language as before. It read, "The matter regarding your property and the tree is not over. You will regret your interference." It wasn't official, but it was enough to make one thing clear. Martha was still fighting from the shadows. That night, as the wind picked up and the branches of the oak swayed gently, the homeowner stood on the porch, staring at the vast silhouette of the tree against the moonlight. The air smelled like rain, heavy with electricity. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, deep and distant, like the earth itself was waking. The oak had weathered 100 years of storms. It would weather this one too, but the homeowner couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The corruption had been exposed, yes, but corruption had roots, deep, hidden, and tangled. And in a place like Maplewood Estates, where appearances meant everything, there was always more beneath the surface. Soon, the investigation would dig deeper. Names would be revealed. Money trails would be traced. And when it was all done, the HOA that had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist might not just lose its power, it might cease to exist altogether. For now, the oak tree stood silent, a monument to patience and defiance. Its roots ran deep beneath the soil, intertwining with the very foundations of the land, older than any board, stronger than any rule book. And as the storm clouds gathered over Maplewood, the homeowner knew one thing for certain. They had planted something far more powerful than revenge. They had planted truth. The morning after the thunderstorm, Maplewood Estates looked washed clean. The streets slick with rain, the sidewalks glimmering in the early sun. Yet beneath that fresh surface, rot still lingered. The storm hadn't washed away the tension. It had only made it quieter, heavier. The oak tree stood tall, droplets of water sliding down its leaves like tears. The homeowner sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the world wake up. The neighborhood had changed. The air used to hum with lawn mowers and morning greetings, but now it was hushed, wary. People peeked through blinds instead of stopping to chat. The HOA's once proud order had crumbled into distrust. Martha Reynolds, the self-appointed queen of Maplewood, was losing her throne. In just a few weeks, her reputation had gone from untouchable to toxic. The ongoing state investigation had revealed even more damning details: falsified invoices, missing dues payments, and a web of financial manipulation stretching back nearly a decade. What had begun as a simple dispute about a tree was now a full-fledged case of embezzlement and abuse of power. Her name was all over the reports. The investigators had traced the missing funds through bank transfers and shell accounts, each one eventually leading back to her or one of her close associates. The findings were undeniable, but Martha wasn't someone who surrendered easily. She had spent years building her little empire, an empire of rules, fines, and fear, and she wasn't about to watch it all burn without a fight. She doubled down. Ignoring legal advice, she began sending newsletters to every resident in Maplewood, written in her trademark tone of authority. She claimed the investigation was a political hit job orchestrated by bitter homeowners who couldn't follow community standards. She painted herself as the victim, the misunderstood leader trying to protect her neighborhood from chaos. At first, a few believed her. Old habits die hard, and fear has a long memory. Some neighbors even rallied behind her, signing petitions to reinstate confidence in HOA leadership. But as more evidence emerged, that loyalty crumbled. The truth was too loud to ignore. One afternoon, the homeowner returned home to find a notice taped to the front door. Not from the HOA this time, but from the State Department of Housing and Property Regulation. It was an official summons for a community hearing. The investigators wanted statements from all affected residents, including those who had received unlawful fines or harassment. It was time to tell their story. not just about the tree, but everything that had followed. The hearing took place in the town hall 2 weeks later. The room was packed. Residents filled every seat, some standing along the back wall. Martha arrived early, dressed in her usual pastel suit, her posture straight and unyielding. She still carried herself like a leader, even as the walls of her authority closed in. The homeowner sat quietly in the second row, holding a folder full of evidence, copies of every letter, every photo, every violation notice, pages upon pages of proof that showed exactly how far Martha had gone. When the proceedings began, the investigators laid everything out in excruciating detail. They projected financial records onto a large screen. Line items, bank transfers, suspicious expenses. They read out dates and figures, connecting them like threads in a web. Every so often Martha would shift in her seat, her jaw tightening. Then came the testimonies. One by one, residents stood to speak. They told stories of intimidation, fines issued without cause, and threats of foreclosure for trivial matters. Chipped paint, flower choices, even leaving garbage bins out too long. Some voices trembled with anger, others with relief. For years they had stayed silent, but now they were being heard. When the homeowner's turn came, the room fell silent. Everyone knew their story had started it all. They described how the oak tree had been targeted, how Martha had tried to disguise personal ambition as neighborhood policy, and how every letter, every threat, had built up to a campaign of control. They didn't speak with fury or vengeance, just quiet conviction. And as they finished, they looked toward Martha, who sat frozen, her eyes cold and hollow. When it was over, the lead investigator thanked them and turned back to the board. The findings were clear. Martha Reynolds had violated multiple state housing laws, embezzled HOA funds, and used her position to target residents for personal gain. The decision was immediate. She was to be removed from her position as HOA president effective immediately, banned from serving on any homeowners association board for life, and referred for criminal prosecution for financial fraud. The room erupted, not in cheers, but in stunned silence. For years, Martha had ruled through fear. No one had imagined a day when she would be powerless. As she was escorted out by 2 officers, her pastel suit seemed to shrink under the fluorescent lights. The Queen of Maplewood had fallen. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to change. The HOA board was temporarily dissolved, its funds frozen and reassigned for audit. The state appointed a provisional manager to oversee the transition until a new board could be elected. For the first time in years, residents felt free. They repainted their doors whatever color they liked. They planted flowers, built swings, and left their garbage bins out without fear of a warning. And the oak tree, the silent witness to everything, became a symbol of their freedom. People began referring to it affectionately as the survivor. Children played beneath its branches again. Couples took photos under its shade. It became the new heart of the community. Yet, even as peace returned, the homeowner couldn't shake a lingering unease. They had learned something about power, how easily it corrupts, how quietly it spreads, and how quickly it can consume good people. A week after the hearing, a letter arrived in their mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Just one line written in shaky handwriting. "You think it's over, but the roots go deeper than you know." The homeowner read it twice, feeling a chill creep through their chest. They looked toward the oak tree, its branches swaying gently in the breeze, and realized that even though the queen had fallen, the game she had played might not be finished. For now, though, the neighborhood was quiet. The air was lighter. The lawns were imperfect but alive. And for the first time in a long time, Maplewood Estates felt like a community again, not a kingdom. The oak tree rustled softly in the wind, its leaves whispering secrets only time could reveal. The days following Martha Reynolds' downfall were calm, almost eerily so. Maplewood Estates, for the first time in years, existed without a ruler. The streets were quieter, the tension had lifted, and neighbors were beginning to rediscover the freedom they'd long forgotten. For the homeowner, life had begun to feel normal again. The oak tree, once the center of conflict, now stood as a monument of victory. Its branches shimmered in the autumn sunlight, and its roots stretched deep and silent beneath the ground, a constant reminder that some things endure, no matter the storm. Yet peace has a way of hiding unease. The anonymous letter still lingered in the homeowner's mind. "You think it's over? But the roots go deeper than you know." It was written in shaky handwriting, no signature, no clues. At first they dismissed it as the last desperate act of a bitter supporter of Martha's regime, someone unwilling to let go of the past. But something about the phrasing felt intentional. Days turned into weeks, and while the community rebuilt itself, small oddities began to emerge. Late at night, motion lights flickered on without reason. The sound of footsteps echoed on the sidewalk when no one was there. Once, early in the morning, the homeowner found tire marks in the dirt near the base of the oak tree, fresh, as if someone had driven up close in the night. At first, it felt like paranoia. But then, the homeowner noticed something stranger. During a routine inspection of the property, they spotted a patch of disturbed earth near the oak's roots, as though someone had been digging. The soil was uneven, darker, freshly turned. The thought of vandals crossed their mind. But when they checked their security camera, the feed had cut out for an entire hour during the night. It was too precise to be a coincidence. They decided to report it to the interim property manager, who had been appointed after the HOA's dissolution. The manager, a middle-aged man named Clark, assured them that it was probably nothing, just kids playing around. But his voice carried a hesitation that made the homeowner uneasy. That night, unable to sleep, they sat on the porch, watching the oak tree under the pale glow of the streetlight. The air was heavy with the scent of damp leaves. Around midnight, the faint hum of an engine echoed in the distance. The homeowner leaned forward, heart quickening. A dark sedan rolled slowly down the street, headlights off. It passed once, then again. The next morning, another letter appeared in the mailbox. This one wasn't typed. It was handwritten again, neater this time. "You stopped Martha, but not the ones she worked for. The tree isn't just a tree." For a moment the words didn't make sense, but as the homeowner read them again, a chill spread through their chest. They thought back to the investigation, the missing money, the falsified invoices, the beautification project. Could there have been something more? Something Martha hadn't done alone? Driven by a growing sense of unease, the homeowner decided to dig deeper, figuratively and literally. They began searching through the old property records again, starting at the county archives. Most of the documents were ordinary, blueprints, lot divisions, and permits from decades past. But buried in the digital records was an old land survey from 1978, long before Maplewood Estates had been developed. There, on the map marked in faint ink, was something unexpected. A notation beside the very lot the homeowner now owned. It read, "Survey marker, protected utility conduit. Do not excavate." The homeowner frowned. They had never seen anything resembling a utility conduit on their land. No access cover, no markings, nothing visible at all. And yet the oak tree stood directly on that spot. It dawned on them slowly. The tree's roots had likely grown around whatever was buried there. Maybe that was why Martha had wanted it gone. Not for beauty, not even for expansion, but to get to what was underneath. The next day, the homeowner rented a ground-penetrating scanner from a local construction company, an idea that had come from one of the investigators who mentioned the term in passing. They worked carefully, scanning the ground around the oak. At first, the display showed the expected layers: soil, stone, and root systems. But then, near the deepest roots, the scanner pinged something solid, something large, rectangular, buried about 6 feet down. The homeowner's pulse quickened. They didn't dig. Not yet. Instead, they contacted the authorities, forwarding the discovery to the same state investigators who had handled the HOA case. Within days, a small team of officials and environmental technicians arrived to assess the finding. When they began digging, the entire neighborhood watched from a distance. What emerged wasn't a pipe or utility box. It was a sealed metal container, rusted but intact. The technicians handled it carefully, brushing away decades of soil until they were able to lift it free. The homeowner stood silently as it was opened. Inside were stacks of folders, brittle with age, old legal documents, survey plans, and handwritten notes from the original land developer who had built Maplewood Estates. The contents told a story few in the neighborhood knew. Decades ago, the developer had been involved in an illegal land acquisition scheme, cutting corners with zoning permits and burying evidence, literally, to cover up the fact that part of Maplewood had been built on improperly purchased land. That protected utility conduit was actually a hidden vault of documents the developer had buried when authorities started closing in. And somehow, Martha Reynolds had found out. The beautification project she had proposed wasn't meant to improve the community. It was meant to dig up that vault and destroy the records. The oak tree had grown over the exact spot where those files were hidden, protecting them all these years. The revelation sent shockwaves through the neighborhood once again. The investigation into Martha expanded into a full-blown probe of the original developer's company, uncovering decades of fraud and shady dealings. Several former associates were arrested. News crews began parking on Maplewood's clean streets, filming reports about the tree that exposed corruption. The homeowner became an unlikely symbol of resistance, not just for standing up to the HOA, but for uncovering something far bigger. Yet, even with the truth revealed, there remained a strange sense of unease. The second anonymous letter had warned that Martha wasn't working alone, and now, with this discovery, that warning made perfect sense. Someone else had known about the vault. Someone else had wanted it gone. As night fell, the homeowner stood under the oak tree once again, running a hand across its bark. The old oak creaked softly in the wind, its roots still buried deep in the earth that had kept so many secrets. The storm had passed, but the roots of Maplewood's corruption went deeper than anyone could have imagined. And as the homeowner turned toward the house, the faint hum of a car engine started up somewhere in the darkness. The discovery of the buried vault transformed Maplewood Estates from a quiet suburban neighborhood into the epicenter of a statewide scandal. For days, news vans lined the streets. Reporters stood under umbrellas outside the gate, and drones hovered above the oak tree like curious birds. The story of the tree that saved a neighborhood spread everywhere, from local headlines to national broadcasts. For the homeowner, the chaos felt surreal. They had once been the target of the HOA's wrath, threatened and fined for protecting this tree. Now that same tree had become a symbol of truth, of defiance, of something greater than rules and fines. But beneath the excitement, unease still lingered. The second letter's warning echoed in their mind. You stopped Martha, but not the ones she worked for, and the sound of that unseen car engine at night, the same dark sedan that had appeared before, continued to haunt them. While the state investigators handled the legal fallout, the homeowner found themselves looking deeper into the old documents recovered from the vault. The papers were mostly contracts, surveys, and invoices from the original developer, but one folder stood out. Its cover was stamped with fading ink that read, Private Holdings, Oak Ridge Expansion Project. Inside were letters, not to the county, but to a private investor. The correspondence was cryptic, but clear enough to reveal intent. The developer had promised the investor future control of certain neighborhood lots in exchange for financial backing. The signatures at the bottom belonged not just to the developer, but to a second party whose name was only partially visible, Emmy Reynolds. The homeowner stared at it for a long moment. Martha hadn't just found those documents. She'd been connected to them. This wasn't just corruption. It was inheritance. The realization sank in like a stone in water. Martha hadn't built her HOA empire out of obsession alone. She had been protecting her family's secret legacy, the buried proof that Maplewood's foundation was rotten from the start, and now that legacy was exposed. As more evidence surfaced, investigators traced the money trail that had started decades ago. They uncovered dormant accounts, shell companies, and quietly sold assets, all linking back to the Reynolds name. Martha's late husband had been one of the original land surveyors who helped hide the fraudulent acquisitions. She had taken over his role in silence, continuing the deception under the cover of HOA bureaucracy. The revelation destroyed what was left of her reputation. Though she was already removed from her post, criminal charges piled up, not just for embezzlement, but for conspiracy to conceal financial fraud. The news confirmed what everyone now suspected. Maplewood Estates had been built on lies, and Martha had spent her life protecting them. Yet even as she was taken away to face justice, one mystery remained unsolved. Who had written those anonymous letters? The first warned of unfinished business. The second said the tree wasn't just a tree. Whoever it was had known about the vault long before it was unearthed. That answer came quietly, one gray afternoon. The homeowner received a visit from one of the state investigators. A calm, middle-aged woman named Evelyn, who had overseen much of the case. She handed over a sealed envelope. "We found this during our final review of the case files," she said. "It was addressed to you." After she left, the homeowner sat at the kitchen table staring at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a single handwritten page. "If you're reading this, it means you found what we couldn't. The oak tree was planted by my grandfather the year before Maplewood was built. He was the original owner of your land, forced to sell it when the developers came. He planted that tree over the very spot where they buried the truth. He told us it would stand watch long after he was gone. I tried to protect it when I could, but the HOA silenced anyone who questioned their history. You finished what he started. Thank you for saving our legacy." It was signed simply, "A friend of the roots." The homeowner folded the letter carefully, emotion welling in their chest. The oak tree wasn't just a coincidence. It had been planted with purpose, a silent guardian over buried lies, holding back the corruption that had taken root beneath it. The realization brought peace, a final understanding that the tree had always been more than wood and leaves. It was history itself, alive and enduring. Over the next few months, Maplewood began to heal. The state disbanded the old HOA permanently, replacing it with a community trust managed collectively by residents. They voted to rename the neighborhood park Heritage Grove and placed a plaque beneath the oak tree that read, "This tree stood against greed, corruption, and time itself. May it remind us that truth, like roots, always finds its way to the light." Life slowly returned to normal. Children played in the yards again. Dogs barked without complaint, and neighbors smiled genuinely for the first time in years. The house that once carried tension now stood as a quiet home filled with calm. Yet sometimes, late at night, when the homeowner sat on the porch with the porch light dimmed, they could still hear the whisper of the wind through the oak leaves. It wasn't eerie. It was comforting, like an old friend telling a story. They thought of the letter's closing words, "You finished what he started," and smiled softly. The oak tree had endured for more than a century. It had seen deception, power, and decay, and it had outlasted them all. Its roots reached deep, not just into the soil, but into the story of everyone who had ever lived under its shade. And though the neighborhood had changed, the oak remained, timeless, unmoved, quietly powerful. It had protected secrets once. Now it stood guard over truth. As dusk settled over Maplewood Estates, the homeowner watched golden light filter through the ancient branches, painting the world in hues of amber and peace. The fight was over. The roots had done their work, and for the first time in a very long time, the air around the oak tree was still.